Well, it's certainly been a pretty day, and I'm glad everyone's here this evening. It's, as every Lord's Day is, it's been a great day. We're continuing our study on what we call the fullness of time, and just a quick review of where we led off last time. We talked about God, who is, of course, omnipotent and omniscient, how his will works along with our will when it comes to us being free moral agents. And in some ways you think, well, they would clash, and of course they do. But then as we pray and God answers our prayer, then our will or our request becomes part of his. So his will kind of gets bigger and bigger, and that way we can be, as he created us, free moral agents, and still be consistent with what he knows as being right. We also talked about situations where, I don't like the term collateral damage, but as history goes on and things happen, sometimes we just get caught up in what happens. And the example he used was when Saul was persecuting Christians in the early church. It went on for a while, so we don't really know how many, but there are a number that he either imprisoned, maybe even was responsible for the death, including and more so than Stephen. And you wonder, why did that go on? Why did these many people have to die before Paul more or less came to his senses? Well, we just don't understand that. And maybe in our lives something is happening where we're helping something progress, but in our own minds we can't figure out why, and that's part of it. Also, as Keaton has talked in lessons of the power of one, talked about Esther, where Mordecai said, maybe, this is your time. You were made for this. Just like the blind man that was born blind, and Jesus made an example. Well, he suffered his whole life being blind for the purpose of providing this proof to who Jesus was. So in our lives too, in this life we may not ever know, but we could be part of something, or we know we're part of something that's a whole lot bigger than we are. And kind of along those lines, maybe we can describe history as being a fabric, and we're all a thread in that large piece of fabric. And we may be small, but we're all interconnected, and we affect things that can happen. Just like a run in a thread, I can remember certain types of clothing, my mother said, don't pull that thread. It was just one end to the other. And so people's lives at one point in time can affect people's lives hundreds or thousands of years later. And we just don't know that ahead of time. So we're all interconnected. So we're talking about history. Some people don't like history, and it may be recollections of what it was like in school. We had to memorize dates and tests and wars and all that kind of stuff. Well, we won't be doing that, but history is important. We could ask the question, why bother studying history? I mean, that's old news. I want to look forward. I'm into today. I'm into the future. Of course, God tells us in Romans chapter 15, verse 4, that history is very important. For whatever things were written before were written for our learning, that we through the patience and comfort of the scriptures might have hope. Well, we learn from history. How good are we at that? We tend to repeat history over and over again, and we just aren't very good at it. But I think there's more to it than that. And part of it is man just seems to, get excited about things and do things right, and then you get a little tired of it, get bored of it, and let's change things a little, or let's not do it at all. And then to get back on board, and things are just kind of go in these cycles. And I guess that's just part of us. That's the way we are. And sometimes we procrastinate about things, we change things, whether it's in the church or attempt to or somewhere else. We just try to make things different. So I thought we'd look at some examples of how this occurred, where at first you get real excited and gung-ho and, nothing's going to stop me from doing it. And then it kind of morphs into, well, I'm getting tired of this, or let's change it to make it exciting and whatnot. And, we'll see that the history of the Jews, that was very typical of the way they went. But I think it's also very typical of mankind. So let's start with some examples of the exciting part, when you're really into something. Got a brand new car. Well, you wash it every week. You wax it every 2 weeks. And you park it way off, and you take up 4 parking spaces so no one will park next to you. And you walk a long way to get to the store and carry your groceries out to it because you're excited about it. How about football teams? The 2-minute warning goes off. They're down by 2 touchdowns, and somehow they score 2 touchdowns and tie the game and go into extra time and win the game in the last 2 minutes. How about crossing the Red Sea? When the nation of Israel left Egypt, they saw what God had done. I mean, firsthand they saw it, and they're all excited about it. And Moses, there's a song of Moses in Genesis chapter 15. Everyone's praising, oh man, how can we go wrong? This is going to be wonderful. With God's help, we can do anything. Last quarter, Jamie's class, we read about how the Jews returned from Babylon to Jerusalem and rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem in 52 days. When you think of it, they didn't have John Deere tractors out there and scaffolding and all that. It was hard, laborious work, and half of them were standing guard, and they had to work with a sword next to them, so that was probably rather aggravating. But it was something they wanted to do. They got together and worked on it, and they did it. How about some of the new congregations that Paul created? I'm sure they were all excited and gung-ho and very evangelistic. And Dave mentioned this Wednesday night. How about Gold Hill when it first started? Now, we weren't here, but I imagine that there was a lot of excitement and a relatively small group, and everyone says, well, if this is going to work, we all got to do something and do as much as we can, do some things. We're not comfortable in doing it, but it's just the way it's got to be. And it reminds me of when Gail and I, we'd only been married a couple of years. We were living north of Jacksonville, Florida, but attending church in a little community called Folkestone, Georgia. It was a very small congregation. Half of the county was the Okefenokee Swamp. So alligators and moccasins far outnumbered the population. And it was very rural. And this congregation had just started in 1976, and this is about 77 or 78 when we were there, so it was brand new. It was the only congregation in the whole county and the only one that had ever been there. So it was really a mission field. Well, just like probably what happened on US 21 here before 77 was built, along 21 there were probably all kinds of motels and restaurants and whatnot because that's how people traveled. But when they built the interstate, that really dried up a lot of the interstate type travel, so those places shut down. And it was that way here too. It was where US 1 went from Jacksonville and then up through this small community, and US 301 and US 1 split. So there were a lot of motels and stuff that had shut down, but there was a welcome center right where 301 and 1 split, and it went out of business. So with some help, that Folkestone congregation bought that old welcome center building. And so we had to convert it to something that could be used as where we could meet. And if you know anything about Florida, between termites and things rotting and all, the whole thing was made out of concrete. It was a poured slab, concrete walls. I had a second story. There was an apartment up there. I guess maybe the manager or the owner of that welcome center lived up there with his family. But the ceiling or the floor was also solid concrete. So we knocked out these walls and put up support posts to support. It was great when you've got pews like this and then a wall of beams right there and trying to serve the Lord's Supper, not bang into stuff. But it didn't, of course, it didn't have a baptistry. So we got one of these fiberglass preformed ones. It sat right on the concrete, no problem, filled up with water. But when you walked up the steps, you're bent over like this because the ceiling was right here. It says, well, that's not going to work. So with that solid concrete floor, we, by hand, chopped a hole in there so when you went up the steps, you could stand up straight and go back down. But you're up in their bedroom, the preacher's bedroom, and you just go up there and look and see shoes and dust bunnies and stuff everywhere. So, well, that's not going to work. So we built a box around it, which looked great in their bedroom, but it worked. So when you're doing things like this, you do whatever it takes. And you're kind of excited about it, and you accept things that aren't perfect, but you go on. So I imagine with Gold Hill, it had some similar things where everything wasn't perfect, but it all worked out, and you all worked together. That's the exciting part. But what happens over a period of time? How about that car that you wash and wax so often and parked way out there? It says, I'm getting tired of washing and waxing that. It's getting a few years on it. Got a few dings where people park right next to me, even though I was a mile away from the store. I'm just not going to take as good care of it. How about that football team where they scored so many points in the last 2 minutes? Well, what were you doing the rest of the game? If you played that good for 2 minutes, why couldn't you have done it all the other time? There's a certain amount of incentive, I guess, wasn't there. I know in high school when I played football, it was up north, and we didn't have any kind of lights. So when the sun went down and got dark, we knew that was when it was time to go in. And it was especially good when the time changed because it got dark real early. But whenever the coach blew the whistle for wind sprints, at the end of the practice, we had to do 10 100-yard dash wind sprints. Of course, we were tired, but we knew the end was near. So just that incentive, knowing it's almost over, can get you through a lot of things. How about crossing the Red Sea? That amazement, that excitement of seeing what God had done kind of morphed into, where did Moses go? Yeah, I know he went up that mountain, but he's been gone for 40 days, I guess we're on our own. We're going to have to do something else. And, they lost that excitement because they were impatient. Or maybe they longed for they remembered what it was like in Egypt. How about rebuilding Jerusalem? 52 days, they got the wall around there. But we can read in Ezra and Nehemiah, it didn't take them long to take foreign wives or take shortcuts and whatnot. So that also can morph fairly easily. And I don't want to make excuses, but I think it's important for us to remember, let's see, I'll get it to work. It's still kind of hard for you to read, but I'll just kind of describe some of the things that are up there. But being a faithful Jew was not easy. These are just some of the examples of some of the things that they were required to do if they were going to be faithful to God in their, these are periodic offerings and festivals that they had to take part of. Now, the ones called sacred dues, offering your firstborn, first fruits, tithes, poll tax, and free will offerings. And when it comes to sacrifices and offerings, peace offerings, burnt offerings, meal offerings, guilt offerings, sin offerings, and a daily sacrifice. And then throughout the year, you got the Sabbath, the Passover, or the Feast of Unleavened Bread, Feast of Tabernacles. If you like camping, I guess that's good. Sabbatical year and the Jubilee, the Day of Atonement. And just as we read in Ezra, there's an offering made at the dedication of the recent newly built house of God, 100 bullocks, 200 rams, and 400 lambs. And then a sin offering for all of Israel. But you do that, and you do it year after year after year, and it's got to get old, it's got to get expensive, and you can kind of see why people say, oh, not this again, and can we do things a little different, or do we have to do it? Can we skip a year? Things like that start entering their minds. Of course, it was there as a way of them helping them to remember what God had done for them. But we can see how that could affect us as well. How about those new congregations that Paul helped to start? Think about the first chapter in Galatians. Paul was amazed at how fast they changed. And don't really know the exact time period, but it was a whole lot shorter than what he ever expected. In Folkestone, I think the congregation is still there. They do have a normal building now. I don't know how well they're doing. But how about here? Has the excitement at Gold Hill that must have occurred back when it was first created, back in the, or formed back in the late 90s, is that excitement still here? Are we still as willing to do whatever it takes? Something for us to to think about. And part of that, I think, is human nature and the way God created nature. Things do go in cycles. They don't just stay like this. You think of animals. If you drive through Tega Cay, you better go slow because there's deer everywhere. Gail and I, one day, we actually had to stop and wait for them to cross. And it's because there's an abundance of food. They don't have any natural enemies. The dogs aren't out running around loose. So they got nothing to be worried about. So the population's going to grow and grow and grow. But sooner or later, there's going to be a disease come along, or they could run out of food, but probably not because people keep planting stuff. But something's going to cause that population to go down. And same thing with insects, even locust swarms. They eat themselves out of house and home. They don't have any more food to eat, so they can't reproduce, so the population just goes down. But it's the same thing with us. You get excited, and then not so much, and kind of go like that. So part of it is our nature, but it requires us to be vigilant, to recognize when that's happening, try to put a stop to it, and also for us to recognize when it's happening to someone else and try to help them out as well. So all that kind of feeds into, again, the fullness of time, where we're leaving what we see in Ezra and Nehemiah, high points and low points, and that's going to continue until the coming of Christ, and it certainly continued since that time, high points and low points. Any thoughts or comments so far along those lines? Okay. Just got a number of connected but thoughts here. I thought we talked about as we're building this case for the fullness of time. And speaking of time, it's just a whole thought about the concept of time. I don't know how much you've thought about it. We constantly use time. I mean, there's a clock there, and before too long, someone's going to go out there and wave, okay, we've got 5 more minutes, because we're on schedules. Most of us have got school, work, doctor's appointments or something tomorrow or this week. Everything's just kind of lined up with time. So we use it all the time. Of course, the Bible's full of it as well. I mean, when God created the earth, he worked 6 days and he rested the 7th. Always thinking about how old people were, like Noah and Methuselah, and how many years they were. There are certain time periods that are so prevalent in the Bible, 3s, 10s, 4s, 40s, things of this sort. So we're all familiar with it. But have you ever thought about exactly what time is? In Revelation chapter 10, verse 6, talks about the destruction of this world. And I'm reading from the New King James Version. You probably may have the ESV. But in verse 6, and swore by him who lives forever and ever, who created heaven and the things that are in it, the earth and the things that are in it, the sea and the things that are in it. But there should be delay no longer. Now, the King James, rather than saying there should be delay no longer, its worded slightly different. And I think it may actually be saying something else to it. But King James states is that there should be time no longer. And I got thinking about that. It says, how can you destroy time? We read about, Peter tells us that, when the end comes, the heavens and the earth, everything's going to be burned up and there's not going to be anything left. Well, that's not that hard to understand, to picture that. We've all had campfires or bonfires where, just like this pile out and back, we're waiting for the next rainy Tuesday and we'll get rid of that pile. And it's about 12 feet tall. But when you're through burning it, there's nothing but a little bit of ashes left. And we've all seen that, and we all understand that. I had a job one time working in Alabama where I was responsible for site preparing and planting. About 150,000 acres was the area that we were in charge of. This is back in the late 80s. And when you cut a stand of timber, there's always a bunch of debris left. And just like in your garden, when you got corn stalks and old vines and stuff out there, you don't go out there and plant the seed. No, you got to prepare it. You got to clean things up. Same thing with planting trees. And one of the best ways and cheapest and fastest ways to take care of it was to burn it. You don't see much of that anymore because of the liability with smoke and all, but it would do a great job of cleaning up a site. So we could have several hundred acres that we're going to burn one day. You take a bulldozer and clean a fire line around it, and we would light the fires with helicopters. And most of the pilots were ex-Vietnam guys that put out napalm, so they had fun doing that, and they knew what they were doing. And our job was to stand on the perimeter, and as this fire was going, make sure it didn't jump on the other side, and if it did, we had to go put it out or call for a tractor. But you can imagine 200 acres, and they'd string it on the outside first and then work their way in, so it just kind of went in the middle. It was like a mushroom cloud. And they could do a great job of cleaning stuff up. And sometimes we call it a moonscape because there was nothing out there. And I've even seen it where there was quartz sand on the top was turned to glass. It got so hot. So we can all visualize physical things burning up. But how can you destroy time? And the only way I could think of it was that when it comes to time, you got to have a reference point. And if you're looking at eternity, there is no reference point. There's nothing there. It'd be like someone took you out 2 hours out in the middle of the ocean, blindfolded, put you in a boat. Okay, tell me where you are. And all you see is sea around, sea and sky. That's it. Nothing else. No land, no other boat. There's no way to tell where you are. Same thing with eternity. There's no reference points. But God created a reference point when he created the earth. That was the starting point, and everything was timed after that. So as long as the earth and the heavens are around, we got a reference point. We can have time. As soon as that's gone, time is gone as well. You just into that endless sea of eternity. So at least in my mind, that's the only way I can get my hand or my mind around something like time being here no longer, because that reference point is nowhere to be found. I don't know if anybody has any other thoughts or ways, but that's just something that struck me when King James says, time will be no longer. I had to think about that one. But thinking about time, again, we all use it, and we're talking about a period of time where we go from the Old Testament into the New Testament. So when it comes to a dating system, one had to be in existence. Now, in the Old Testament, the Jews had a 12-month calendar. In fact, they had two calendars. One they called a sacred calendar, and one was more of a civil. It's kind of like we have a calendar we all typically use, but a lot of companies have their own calendar, a fiscal calendar. And they can start at any point. It's just when they want to start their reporting and their annual reports and things of this sort. And same way with the Jews. Their sacred calendar started about this time of year, and it was tied to agriculture and their festivities, Passovers and Pentecost and things of that sort. And their civil calendar started 7 months prior to it. So, that probably made it a lot of fun when you got 24 months in a year, I guess, at least different months. And they have names for them, like Nisan was the first month of the sacred calendar. But it's interesting to note that the Jews just counted those months, 1, 2, 3, 4 through 12, prior to being part of the Babylonian captivity. But when they returned to Jerusalem, they had all these names of the month, which were actually Babylonian names. Just like the three friends of Daniel, the names they always used in the Bible were their Babylonian names, not their Jewish names. And this is going to feed into part of the fullness of time where even in our lives we've seen it, where things that have happened in the past, it doesn't just go away, it is part of us, and we just add to it. And here, as the Jews left Babylon, and the Persians allowed them to return, they brought a lot of things with them. And think about when Nebuchadnezzar occupied Jerusalem. when one company takes over another, one way is to do it, well, we're just going to take all the good stuff and destroy all the other, and we'll just go on our merry way. But a smarter one would be, let's take the good stuff, but let's also take the good people and their copyrights and all that kind of stuff and add to what we have, and we'll go forward. And that's what Nebuchadnezzar did. He took like Daniel and all the smart young people in there that they could kind of mold and shape and use their knowledge. And it made Babylonia a stronger one that way. But when it comes to time, our way of telling time, using BC and of course AD and whatnot, prior to that, every civilization used or counted years according to how long it's been. Maybe like a king was in power. And we saw this in Ezra 1:1. Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia. So that's how they dated that year. It was the first year of that king's reign. In Nehemiah, chapter 2, and it came to pass in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of Artaxerxes, the king, that wine was before him. So again, it continued this. And the Jews did it that way, and the other civilizations counted years according to their kings and whatnot. But you can imagine how confusing that was if you ever tried to put that together. So in 525 AD, there was a monk named, he was Greek, Dionysius Exiguus, or Gis. He introduced the AD dating system. So it was pegged to the birth of Christ. So BC was before Christ, and AD was not after death by Anno Domini, which is Latin for year of the Lord. So he used the best records he could at that time. This is 525 AD. So again, everybody just kind of kept records however best they could. So he counted back. Well, he was off by 4 years, so I guess Christ was actually born in 4 BC. But also at that time, 0 was not in their vocabulary. So their timing went from year 1 BC to 1 AD. It's a 2-year period because 0 wasn't part of it. So that was something else that entered into it. But in this system of dating things was accepted by Charlemagne, who was the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, and was in widespread use in Europe in the 1500s. But I thought it was interesting, and according to the internet, which you can believe everything, but this way of dating years, the way that we do it now, became an international standard in 1988. I thought, what? I mean, we were all born before then, and it was common practice for us. But that's when it became the international standard. So, things are tied to that. One thing, sometimes we think about history and other things, certain things come to mind or we have impressions about things, and they may not always be all that accurate. One example, growing up, we probably learned this expression. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Okay. So, he took a trip in 1492. Well, like Paul Harvey would say, there's a lot more to it than that. He took 4 trips. The farthest north he got was Haiti. He spent all his time cruising up and down the east coast of Central and South America, hoping to either determine that this is the West Indies I'm hunting for, or a way I can get past this land to get through and then go on. Which the closest he got to the Pacific was down in Panama. So he's pretty close, but of course he just didn't know it. But all we remember is 1492, but there's a whole lot more to it than that. World War II, we think about December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. Pretty familiar with that. D-Day was June 6th, I think 44. That comes to mind, and VE and VJ days. But there's a whole lot more to World War II than just those few dates. I mean, it started way back in the 30s when Hitler came to power. And it lasted a good bit after 1945, after we had peace with Japan. Started when I was about 13. I worked afternoons and on Saturdays, and then 6 days a week in the summer at a lady's yard just up the hill from where I lived. I wonder, how can you work that much in a lady's yard? Well, her husband owned an ornamental nursery, so he had acres and acres of rhododendron and andromeda and taxus and hemlock, all kinds of stuff. She was an art teacher at the high school, but she worked for the American Red Cross in Japan right after World War II as part of a reconstruction project. So she was over there and really got to like the architecture that she saw in Japan. She put his green thumb, her artistic ability, and her love of Japanese architecture, and her yard was full of all kinds of shaped and trimmed stuff and little old bridges and fish ponds and all kinds of stuff that if you have a yard like that, you better keep up with it or it's going to be a mess. But that's just an example of how even after peace was made in World War II, how long the influence of that. And we all know about what happened in Germany, how it was split and the Russians went in there, built the Berlin Wall, and it wasn't all that many years ago when the Berlin Wall came down. So history isn't, even though we look at dates and we think of this, it isn't nearly that clear cut. And I think our next slide will maybe help to make that point clear. As we read in Daniel chapter 2 about the statue that Nebuchadnezzar saw in his dream, this is that situation where he wanted his wise men to come tell me not only the interpretation of his dream, but what the dream was. And they said, we can't do that. He says, well, you better. And of course, Daniel was brought forward and says, yeah, I can tell you. Of course, this depicts the gold of the head and the silver and on down the body, and it's a sequence of nations where you have the Babylonians are in reign now, but you won't be forever. There'll be another kingdom come along. Of course, there's the Medo-Persians and the Greeks and the Romans, and the feet made out of clay and iron. So when you get a mixture like that, it's not very good. And also talked about that rock that was cut out of the mountain without hands that destroyed the whole thing, of course, referring to Christ. But when you look at something like this, it gives you the impression, okay, Babylonians are going to be conquered by the Medo-Persians. Babylonians are out of the picture. Then come along the Greek. The Persians are out of the picture. The Romans, Greeks are out of the pictures. But it's not like that at all. It's a amalgamation of all these different civilizations. One affects the other. And so that's where we all work. We all went to high school and then either college or work or the service or something of that sort. And all of our experiences just keep adding to it. And we're going to see that as we approach the fullness of time, that the Jews became influenced by all these different things around it. But that's what made the fullness of time what it was. It all contributed to this. And probably really not going to be able to see this slide. Yeah. Well, this will work okay if you're not colorblind. If you're colorblind, then I'll let you go to sleep. But what this is each of the rows that was on an Excel spreadsheet is a date. You can see you got a section up top that's kind of a light gray, then a black, then a light gray, and a black. Well, there's 4 periods. Each one is 480 years, so it's not equal lengths of time for each row. I kind of grouped a little bit. But the first row, we'll talk about this some next week too, because I think there's a lot to it. But the first row is when Abram was called from the Ur of Chaldees to go out. And then the yellow, again, hopefully you're not colorblind. What I might could do next time is split it in half. But the main thing I wanted to see here, and we'll come back to it, is the purple color was the Jews. And they started with Abram, And in the very bottom is when Jesus was born. And you'll see a lot of purples. Well, the yellow at the top, well, that represents when Egypt was active. And then the green was the Assyrians, the red was the Babylonians, then blue the Medo-Persians, it's a dark green color, it's Greece, and finally at the bottom was Rome. These when they are active. But you see the Jews were active all across all those civilizations. And I think it's interesting to note that, I'll split it up where we can see it better next time, that where these different activities showed up. One thing that's kind of interesting is Egypt. What do we think about when it comes to the relationship between the Jews and Egypt? What comes to mind? Pardon? Yes, slavery, and when they're enslaved in Egypt. That's our foremost thing. But Egypt was active as a powerful country in one way or another throughout this whole timeline between Abraham and Jesus. But we usually don't think that way, and yet they were influential. You think of Jeremiah was taken there. Well, one thing, Abraham went to Egypt. That's one of the two times he lied about who Sarah was. Jeremiah was taken a prisoner to Egypt. Jesus, his parents took him to Egypt to escape. So we usually don't think of it as being a country, but it stayed influential throughout all of this. Whereas other ones were in existence for a fairly short period of time, and someone took them over. But between the Egyptians and the Jews, they lasted throughout all of this. And again, we'll go into it in more detail next time. But I thought it was interesting that the Greeks, we usually think of the Greeks as Alexander the Great, but they were in existence as more of city-states rather than being united really early on. Because the story of Troy and the Trojan horse, it was really high up there. And we'll see how people like Socrates and Aristotle and Plato were contemporaries with Malachi. We usually don't associate those, but it was happening at the same time. So, and I think, again, these are important relationships for us to at least think about a little bit as we move towards the fullness of time, because that's what contributed to it.
What's interesting about this, Bob, is that I never thought about it, but when you see a graph like that, and then you think of God, He's manipulating the world, somehow involved in all of that in time, and everything's come out the way we desire.
Isn't that amazing how, it's God plans, and again, we have blinders and are short-sighted, but all these millions of things happening at the same time, all going towards His plan for man's benefit, whether we realize it or not. But yeah, I think if we get this a little more visually acceptable, to me, it kind of opened my eyes somewhat on how all these things are interrelated. And so we're close to our time, and I'll clean that up for next time. I guess next week we'll have the Lads to Leader having a great presentation for them during this time. But luckily, this type of subject matter is something that isn't hard to, interruptions don't really cause any problems. So let's have a prayer before we leave. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for your love and all you've given to us and continue to do each and every day. Thank you for your great wisdom and your help in our lives. And you do so much for us that we don't realize what's going on, and pray that we'll always be appreciative and aware of your love and your involvement in our lives, and never grow tired of those things, tired of you or tired of each other. Thank you so much for Jesus, who came and has done so much and continues to do so much for us. In His name we pray. Amen.